Okay, I have a pretty good innate sense of what time it is because it was 11 minutes and I thought that little timer thing was wrong. So I was right. The timer thing was wrong. Okay, well, let's get back to polls versus studies and let's talk a little bit about wording effects. Okay, so we've got, do you favor an amendment prohibiting abortions? Being asked to half of the respondents. The other half of the respondents were asked, do you favor protecting the life of the unborn child? Now, we could sit here and argue about whether those are actually equivalent questions because I don't think that they are. But, so it could be that the respondents who were more likely to agree with the favor protecting the life of an unborn child were reacting to those things that are unequal about these two questions. That's possible. But what I'd like to focus on is hot button words again. In American vernacular, words like prohibiting are very negative words. And so if you phrase a question where it includes words like prohibit, limit, restrict, deny, words like that, you will always get fewer Americans to agree to that statement than if you say things like protecting, enhancing, preserving, freedom, anything like that. You're going to get a larger number of Americans who will agree with that statement. So wording effects, it can really be a function of us accidentally or on purpose including words that cause people to be more or less likely to want to agree with it. And a careful pollster could write their questions in such a way to ensure that they get people to respond to the questions the way that they want them to. Here's another example. Do you think the United States should increase spending on foreign aid, decrease spending on foreign aid, or keep it about the same? Okay, so that's the question that was asked initially, and the 14% of the respondents thought that we should increase, 32% thought we should decrease, and 49% thought we should keep the same amount of foreign aid. Okay, let's change one word. Let's change foreign to humanitarian. So now, just by switching it from foreign to humanitarian, look at how the numbers flipped. Now we've got 32% thinking it should be increased and 14% thinking it should be decreased. Interestingly, stay the same is the most popular answer. There's one thing that we do know about people who respond to polls is they do favor the status quo. It's pretty much just go with what we're already doing. It seems to be working. So you're always going to notice stay the same is the number one answer. So just by using foreign versus humanitarian, now of course encompassed in the word humanitarian is an implication that it's probably largely foreign, but the respondent is more willing to agree to humanitarian because that word sounds better. All right, how about this Roper poll? Okay, you guys are going to love this one. They literally called people on the phone back in 1990 and they asked them, well, I don't know if ask is the right word. As you know, the term Holocaust usually refers to the killing of millions of Jews in Nazi death camps during World War II. Does it seem possible, or does it seem impossible to you, that the Nazi extermination of the Jews never happened? What? Right? I mean, that's a double negative. Does it seem impossible that it never happened? If I say yes, am I saying that I think it never happened? What? So you get 32% of people who either doubted or were unsure of whether the Nazi extermination of the Jews ever happened. I remember this poll came out when I was just starting my PhD, and it was all over the news, and it was something we talked about in class. We talked about how to phrase questions in accurate ways and things like that. And a lot of times people were focusing their criticism of the study on the, on the respondents. Like, how could people not know that there had been a Holocaust? How can people be so ignorant? What's wrong with our school system? Stuff like that. Well, I like what Gallup did. Gallup said, why don't we just ask the question again and be a little bit more straightforward about it? So they called a different group of people and they said, do you doubt that the Holocaust happened or not? Now look at the number of people who doubted or were unsure. It went from 32% in the Roper poll, and now it's at 13% in the Gallup poll. So there's still a subset of people who don't know if there really was a Holocaust, but it's nowhere near what, a third of the people in the population thinking that it had never happened. Gallup's question was much more straightforward. I'm still not jazzed with pollsters' tendency to say, do you doubt or not? And they do that a lot in polling. Do you think this or not? And it's like, why do you throw in the or not? If you're giving them a range of choices, why are you throwing in the or not? I just think that adds to confusion. But that's another criticism in how pollsters design their questions. Definitely, the words that we use, the phrases that we use, can affect the answers people give. Speaking of phrases and terms that we use, if we use complex terms, if we use words that people aren't very familiar with, I usually ask people in class, well, what do you think people do when they're not sure what they're being asked? And a lot of times students will say, oh, well, they probably ask for clarification. Well, that would be great if they would ask for clarification, but that's usually not what they do. When people are confused, they usually just say they disagree. So for example, they set up a table outside of the, whoops, I went the wrong way, sorry. They set up a table outside of the New York Museum of Natural History. And they asked people who were coming out of the museum, would you be willing to participate in a survey about the museum? So they just got done looking at plants and fossils and stuff like that in the museum. So presumably they're interested in those things, right? Now in the survey, all mixed up together were different questions, so that you didn't see these things right next to each other like you're seeing them on the screen. But mixed up, among other things, they were asked, how interested are you in botany or paleontology, plants and trees, and fossils? Now you guys being college students know that botany and plants and trees are virtually the same thing, and paleontology and fossils are basically the same thing. But you'll notice how many more people agreed that they liked botany and paleontology. I'm sorry, plants and trees and fossils than liked botany and paleontology. Now it's possible that literally they know that botany means the study of plants and trees, and they're like, well, I don't want a degree in it or anything. I just, really like plants and trees. But probably not. Probably they saw the word botany, they didn't know what it was. They probably figured if they like it, they would know what it is, and so they must not like it. So they said, no, I'm not interested in that. Even though, in another question, 77% of them said, yeah, I like plants and trees. It kind of implies that when they don't understand what they're being asked, they say no rather than asking for explanation. So one of the things that pollsters need to be careful about is using proper terms. You don't want to use complex terms that your respondents aren't likely to understand. So you end up with polls like there was a Kinsey sex survey, sexual knowledge survey, and it had complex terms, and then in parentheses it would have the simplified, sort of more like casual term for the same thing, and so it comes off sounding really kind of dumb. I'm trying to think of an example that wouldn't just come off as in the middle of a research methods class. You don't want to hear me saying inappropriate words. So I'm trying to think of an example from the survey that wasn't the street slang wasn't a dirty word. Well, I'll just say they asked about self-checks of testicles and then put in parentheses balls. And it's like, oh, that sounds really weird. Why'd you guys do that? But it's to avoid this complex terms problem. When you're going to be asking people who may not be familiar with the formal scientific word for things, you want to make sure that you also give them the words that people do know. This is not relevant. I already showed that to you. Okay. So what we basically see in people's responses to complex terms and to the way that things are worded is that they are unwilling to reveal their ignorance. They don't want to say, I don't know. I don't understand this. So here's a good example where people didn't want to reveal their ignorance. Some participants were called and were asked, does Michigan spend, they were Michigan residents, by the way, does Michigan spend too much, too little, or the right amount on prisons and corrections? And we see about we'll just call it a third. Third say too much, third say not enough. Okay. Another group of people were called and they were asked, now we're getting a little bit more specific, is the $1.3 billion too much, too little, or the right amount? So now that people know, oh my gosh, it's 1.3 billion, all of a sudden it's at like 55% think that's too much. I didn't realize it was 100, I didn't realize it was 1.3 billion. Wow, that's a lot of money. Now we get even more specific. Is the $23,700 per prisoner too much, too little, or the right amount? Now we're at 74% of people thinking that's too much. The more specific the information is that's contained in the question, the more competently the respondents can give their opinion. The people in the first case, where it was just the vague, do they spend too much, too little, or right amount, they probably had no idea in God's green earth how much is spent on prisons. And so they were evenly split pretty much between too much, too little, and the right amount. As it got more specific, I don't have to reveal my ignorance and say how much is spent. I can see it in the question. Now all of a sudden I'm starting to think, okay, that might be too much. Okay, that's way too much when it gets really specific. Because of course $1.3 billion, you still have variables such as, well, how many prisoners is that? And maybe we need that amount and things like that. But when you find out it's $23,000 per prisoner, then you start to think, wow, that is a lot of money. That's like a lot of people's take-home pay for the year. And then suddenly becomes a lot of money. So revealing ignorance is something that people are very reluctant to do in these kinds of polls. Just to highlight that, you've probably seen jaywalking on The Tonight Show, or Jimmy Kimmel does this also, or is it I get the Jimmy Kimmel and Jimmy Fallon guys mixed up. But they like to go out and they poll people out on the street. This is an example of that kind of thing where 1/3 of people who were surveyed offered an opinion about the Public Affairs Act, even though there is no such thing as a Public Affairs Act. There was one where, and I can't remember if it was Jimmy Kimmel or who it was. They asked people their opinion on Martin Luther King's speech that had been given earlier that day. And obviously, Martin Luther King Jr. died in 1968, so what are you guys talking about? But I'm not going to say anything. Maybe you're talking about somebody else I don't know, or maybe I thought that guy was dead, but maybe I'm wrong. And oh, I do have an opinion on the speech he gave this morning. And it's like, oh. Sometimes it's better to just go, I thought that guy was dead, than it is to give an opinion on a speech that he couldn't have possibly given this morning, right? Yeah. But people don't like to reveal their ignorance. So polls we are justifiably wary when we hear the results of polls, aren't we? All right, let's go ahead and take a break, and I will pick up with the next segment and talk about the answer options.